All right. So good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you here this evening. And thank you so much for your interest in joining us tonight for our third installment of Ray in Action, which is our seminar series to highlight the expertise of our wonderful faculty in the Ray School of Business. And just really thrilled to have you here this evening. There may be a lot of other people coming in. This is a very popular topic with over 100 RSVPs, but in the interest of time, we do want to go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, I just want to thank you all for coming. My name is Josh Lefebvre. I'm the director of the Office of Graduate Business Programs. And our programs range from our residential MBA, our online MBA. Many of you are in these programs, our healthcare MBA programs, as well as several specialized masters. And our presenter tonight, Dr. Alan Belasen, teaches several different courses, many of which are in the online MBA program, including one of our core courses, which is the Organizational Leadership Behavior course, but he also teaches several courses in leadership, global leadership, communication, and so on. So I'll go ahead and actually read his bio here in a second, but just a couple of logistics type things that we always try to start with, and I'm sure you've heard much of this with the pandemic. We're living on Zoom more now than ever, but what I want to start with is just welcome you to chat, put anything in the chat, any questions that you have during the course of the presentation, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the course of the talk. And at the end, I'll be asking those of Dr. Belasen, although I know he is going to introduce a couple of different times where he'd like some participation. So I have enabled you to be able to unmute yourselves. And if you have any opportunities where you feel like you'd like to share, we certainly welcome that. Part of the conversation of leadership is about having those philosophical thoughts and experiences to draw upon and to grow from. So the chat function is there as well as that when called upon. Other than that, if you have any questions, you can certainly message me privately or raise your hand. This recording will be available afterwards to those who are RSVP'd to attend. So that is something we'll be sending to you after. In the meantime, I'd like to again welcome you, and let me introduce our speaker this evening, and I'll hand it right over to him. Dr. Alan Belasen holds a PhD from Rockefeller College, which is part of the SUNY system. For over 30 years, Dr. Belasen has been involved in executive education and development programs in the US and abroad, which include in startups, business enterprises, multinational companies, nonprofits, government agencies, academic institutions, as well as healthcare organizations. The MBA courses that he teaches for our programs focus on leadership behavior and development, corporate communication, global communication, and cross-cultural competence and management ethics. Dr. Belasen has written over 150 journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers on topics related to executive education, self-managed work teams, HR competencies, work motivation, women's leadership, and so on. The list goes on, and I'm sure you've had a chance to read some of that as well in his bio. But he did tell me to keep it short, so I'll stop there. But clearly that tells us that he has dedicated his entire career to the study of leadership, and we're in for quite a treat tonight. So I'd like to welcome all of you for being here, and Dr. Alan Belasen, thank you so much for sharing of your time this evening and your expertise. And I'll go ahead and hand it right over to you.
Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate the kind words, and I welcome the audience, the rest of you, and hopefully you will enjoy this presentation, learn something new, and perhaps take some steps to become more adaptive. Of course, for me, the biggest adaptive challenge is to take the last 20 years of my work in this area and pretty much condense it into 35 minutes of the quick presentation on the topic. So please bear with me. I have a sufficient number of slides with evidence and models and interesting concepts that I'm going to share with you. But depending on the time, I may skip some or switch to a Q&A instead of just talking. I want to start actually by suggesting to you the impact that two industry giants and actually later two scholars had on my thinking about teaching and development in the area of adaptive leadership. The first one that comes to my mind right away is Andy Grove and his concepts of paranoid manager and matrix minds. And the second one is Jack Welch, axioms about changing before the environment changes and the need to have very strong anticipation skills. Just to give you a quick background about these two industry giants, those of you who are not familiar, Andy was CEO and chairman of Intel, excuse me, which he grew in 1997, many years ago, to become the 7th most profitable company among Fortune 500. And I'm sure that all of you are familiar with Jack Welch, who made GE into the most valuable company in the world back then in 2000, with a market cap of almost $600 billion. Since then, of course, GE changed, but Jack Welch is the one that influenced my thinking about adaptive leadership. So I want to move on and share with you a few principles and some thoughts that both of them, Jack and Andy, help to pull together in directing their companies. The first one, only those who constantly try to anticipate change will survive when change happens. So here, of course, the whole idea of being proactive, of anticipating change is very important. And of course, the main axiom right here is the survival of the fittest. The one that matched the new conditions of the environment is also able to survive and be in front of the market rather than lag the market. So this is a very important principle. The second one, seek the perspectives from people in points of impact. They have the know-how, they're familiar with customer bases, they can sense impending changes very soon, actually sooner than top executives. The third principle that both of them kept emphasizing in their talks and in writing was to encourage divergence of ideas. And for me, what it meant simply is to play the devil advocate. And Jack Welch used to do it all the time during his strategic planning sessions with his top executives. And the other points here very quickly, find out what others, for example, competitors, do about change. And of course, avoid the pitfall of applying old solutions to new problems. If you do that, that's a sign that you are in a strategic inflection point when you actually need to respond to disruptive change in the business environment quite effectively. On the academic side, I found Bob Quinn from the University of Michigan, Competing Values Framework, and his focus on paradoxes, and Ron Heifetz from Harvard School of Business, concept of adaptive leadership, immensely valuable. So what I want to do, I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that they mention in their writing, share them with you, and show you how I translated these ideas into helping managers and leaders to adapt better to their work environment. So essentially, they're talking about thinking holistically. If we're going to translate it into something that we can understand, so the idea here is to try to think in terms of 180, both sides are equally important, in a non-binary way. Try to develop a holistic view of the world. Adopt to yourself behavioral flexibility, which is a very important concept of adaptive change in the behavior. This also enables you, the leader, to recognize systemic problems that do not have very easy answers and build trust by building strengths of individuals and teams. So the whole notion of teams and teamwork is very important here. So some of their ideas more specifically, and they're listed in those bullets, get on the balcony. I'm going to try to expand a little bit on each one of these points. by spotting trends that prevent you from unconsciously becoming trapped in binary solutions. So here, the idea, of course, is to balance the macro side of organizations, what I'd like to refer to in my own writing, the outside-in perspective, with the micro or the inside-out perspective. So one idea here is to integrate broad goals with SMART goals. And I have a feeling that most of you are familiar with the acronym SMART that stands for specific, measurable, action-oriented, reasonable, and timely. So if you look at the macro and micro relationship here, it's more like means and chain of objective. The specific goals help leaders to achieve their broad overarching goals. Let's continue. Identify adaptive challenges. Some examples are growing competition on the outside. Currently, the impact of the pandemic that require people throughout the company to learn new ways of doing business, develop perhaps new competencies, and we'll talk more about this in some of the models that I will share with you. Build trust and focus, of course, on teamwork. Part of this is to try to regulate your own distress level. And that comes from emotional intelligence theory. Control your emotions, recalibrate your leadership style by having very strong situational awareness. And in one of the models, I'll show you what it means by that. What you want to do essentially is making people feel safe because change is very overwhelming. Maintain discipline, attention. And of course, the idea here is, especially during crisis, people tend to defer judgment to leaders. And what you want to do as a leader is to communicate with a lot of confidence and poise. The next couple of points really suggest alignment between leadership and management. Balancing transactional roles with transformational roles is very important because it helps you to create the capacity that allow you to pretty much flex your muscles and respond to different situations as the conditions continue to change. So give the work back to employees, going back to the notion of teamwork and team, build trusting relationships, encourage risk-taking, and of course, accountability. Let people own their solutions. And finally, protect leadership voices from below suggests that leadership is not bound by the hierarchy. And you have to have strong empathy and recognize inputs by other people. Now, I want you to bear in mind all of these principles and ideas that I just mentioned that cut across between the two industry giants that I suggested to you and the two scholars. Because in a strange way, or maybe in a twist of the history, surprisingly, traditional formats of leadership and command structures are still the prevailing modes of leading and organizing. So on the one hand, we're talking about adaptive leadership. And on the other hand, the structures, the systems, the processes that exist are still predominantly pyramidal structure. When you lead through the hierarchy, you create conditions that evolve into risk-averse behaviors, a lot of conformity. You can read the metaphor about the imbalance here. There's, of course, the fear of losing control on the part of managers and fear of authority on the part of employees. And once again, hierarchies are still the dominant forms of many organizations. You can clearly see the cause and effects relationship that lead to the highlighted line here, that organizations are overmanaged and underled. If you're familiar with theory X, you see it right here, theory X in action. So these are all very important notions because they clearly suggest the need to challenge the binary. I'm going to put all these bullets here together because what you see here is really the relationship between being transactional versus being transformational, with the whole notion of the need to balance one with the other. You really need to have both and to develop the capacity to act out your transactional roles, and when necessary, to act out transformational roles to bring about effective solutions to your organizations. So the question that we have, of course, is what makes an effective leader? And let me just bring the whole shebang here and suggest the whole notion of behavioral flexibility one more time. It's the both and orientation that allow adaptive leaders to deal with immediate priorities and at the same time, not to lose sight of long-term goals. This is what I refer to as situational awareness. You adapt to different contexts. Sometimes you have to act or to work with strategists, and sometimes you need to work with individualists. Transactional skills are very important because they provide you with the core knowledge to manage processes in the organizations. Those of you who have taken some management courses are familiar with the acronym POSCORD, which really suggests planning, organizing, directing, controlling, reporting, and even budgeting. And of course, transformational qualities that are part of the leadership process. Here, I always like to highlight the 4 I's of transformational leadership: individual consideration, intellectual stimulation, idealized influence, and inspirational motivation. You really need to have both. And what helps leader manage the relationship between transactional and transformational qualities is emotional intelligence, and we'll come back to it in another slide. So I'm now shifting gear rather quickly, and I apologize for doing it fast, to a model that I use quite frequently that help to contextualize the adaptive challenges that leaders are confronted with. We refer to this model as the competing values framework. It recognizes organizations as contradictory systems, and this is why I picked up the title for this model, as you see here. The quadrants themselves suggest polar opposites and therefore competing tensions. For example, the upper right quadrant that is defined by create suggests the importance of change, and the polar opposite, if you go diagonally to the lower left quadrant, you will see the word comply, which really suggests the need for stability. So here you have competing tensions between change and stability, forces that are quite antagonistic. You want to preserve the organization, but at the same time, you want to move forward as the market continues to change. Same thing with the other diagonal. On the one hand, in the upper left quadrant, you have the term collaborate that suggests the importance of engagement. And on the other hand, the polar opposite, if you move diagonally and you see compete, that suggests the need to generate profits, to focus on performance, and to drive the organizational strategies forward. Once again, this model is important because, as you will see later, and I've used it in my management development program, we map out the organizational performance, the trajectory of the organization, where the organization is currently operate versus the profile of the organization in the future. And the gap or the distance between the two suggests the need to adapt, the need to change. And with that in mind, a separate model of leadership can help me to explain to managers how to measure up against the changes that the organizations is undergoing. And this helped them to recreate the balance or the alignment between their profiles and the profile of their organization. The roles of that executives tend to play that match this model are motivator, vision setter, taskmaster, and analyzer. We did a lot of research, empirical research in this area, and we found out that by blending the four roles together, executives, top executives, CEOs, are able to perform optimally when it comes to business performance, financial performance, and stakeholder satisfaction. So if I'm going to sort of superimpose two profiles on the competing values framework, you will see an approximation of two profiles, one that suggests the current profile of the organization with heavy focus on the left side of the model. And on the other hand, the future profile suggests the new trajectory where the organization would like to be in the future. In other words, the idea here for the organization is to shift gear from the left side to the right side. And this is very important because in many ways, it will give some signals to executives, managers, professionals, employees, that if this is the direction of the organization, this is where and how they will need to retool, repurpose, or relearn some new skills, new roles, new behaviors to match the direction of the organization. I did a lot of work in this area, and each and every time in consulting engagement, we found out the almost like a paradox, the tension between the CEO vision and where the CEO would like to push the organization in terms of the future, and the existing reservoir of skills that top executives, managers, and others have. And then you see some gap or you see some tension. On the one hand, there are these forces that tell you, hey, I'm not going to move in the direction of the future because it is still the unknown. It is a major challenge for me. I'm moving out of my comfort zone, and I better stay where I feel comfortable with. And then there's a lot of tension, not only in terms of behaviors and emotions, but also in terms of performance. So one idea here is to try to understand the new configuration of the organization. What is the vision of my CEO? And whether I have the capacity in terms of skills and roles that I can use to push my agenda of learning forward in line with the organizational strategy and goal. So this is pretty much suggests the same idea of realignment. There is the strategic fit where you are now. You match very well in terms of your repertoire of skills and roles with what the organization expects you to do. And yet there is also strategic stretch where the organization wants you to go. There's always a gap between the present and the future. Once you learn certain skills, if you don't continue to learn, these skills become pretty much obsolete, if I can use this term. In other words, they're not in line with the new direction of the organization. And the requirement for realignment is part of the adaptive challenge. And that's the point of, or the focus of this presentation. So aligning managers and leaders with business objectives is important because it also helps to increase satisfaction and personal commitment. And on the other hand, it also helps to optimize organizational performance. I always like to use the metaphor of, I don't know how many of you are driving your cars with steak. I'm the old fashioned, so I still have the steak. I live in Voorstville, and so when I go back home from the Albany area, I need to go up 155, and then I need to adjust and realign in many ways the gear with the with the topography, so to speak. I go up the hill, I use lower gear, I go down the hill, I go higher gear. The whole idea here is to align and realign, to make sure that you are fully recalibrated with the direction of the new condition, organization, car, or anything else. So when alignment is effective, members have a clear and shared sense of purpose. The organization is aligned from within, and the organization is aligned on the outside. It's both the outside-in perspective and the inside-out perspective. Here I want to show you a couple of diagrams with those roles that executives play. Here's one profile that matched the current profile of the organizational performance that I shared with you a couple of slides before. And here is the new direction that suggests a shift from the left side of the model to the right side. And of course, the distance between the two suggests opportunities for learning. And that's part of the adaptive challenge. What kind of skills and competencies, what kind of knowledge I do need to have to match the new direction of the organization. Here's another example of it, but from a competency perspective. So on the right side, you have a list of competencies that if you acquire, you will be in line with the new direction of the organization. So that is the idea here, to go through continuous improvement by learning new skills and acquiring new competencies. Now, this presentation is not really about the how you do it, but more about recognizing the need for change and the options that are available for you to match the new direction of your organization. That's what you see here. So profile awareness is very important. If you're in a position to broaden your capacity around the roles that the competing values framework suggests, so you actually become effective in managing change. This is the open adaptive. The conceptual producer is the one that is geared more toward performance, okay? And yet that manager, in this case, it's a standard model, but it shows clearly that not only that you're geared to performance, you also is aware of the well-being of individuals working in your organization. The peaceful team builders is someone that pretty much balance the socio-technical systems. So you're geared more inwardly toward internal processes. The one that we actually elevate and refer to as the master leader is the one that is able to develop capacity in all of the quadrants and across all of the roles. And this capacity is important because it gives you a chance to use behavioral flexibility. So as conditions vary or change, you have the competency to navigate the change optimally by making sure that the behaviors and the roles that you use are in line with the new expectations. With that in mind, there's also a need to remember that pushing your strength, which is really the comfort zone of most of us, to excess becomes a weakness. Too much of a good thing is not good. And so really the overarching theme of this presentation is about balancing your skills, your roles, your behaviors, and as you will see pretty soon, also your personality traits. So this is one example of what happened when you shift away from the positive zone that is described by strength right here on the left side. And if you continue to overemphasize one particular role, in this case, the director, then you are perceived as unreceptive, very impersonal, very cold. If you happen to be the monitor, the perception of you is more like a micromanager. And this is very important because it's about perception of others, of how well you perform your role as an executive, as a leader. And if you're not aware of the need to balance, if you're not aware of the trade-offs across the different roles, very quickly you push the envelope on one particular area to the point that it becomes excess. And if it's excess, it becomes a weakness. So right here, I'm highlighting one example, the monitor, the technical expert who is well aware of the need to be skillful when it comes to analytics, operations management, informatics, and so on and so forth, can push his or her knowledge and skills to excess to the point that people start to perceive you as unimaginative. You neglect possibilities because you become more like narrow-minded. You tend to emphasize, if I'll use the metaphor of the competing values framework, the lower left quadrant of it. These are some examples of profiles that are less effective. And you can see the main difference between the cluster of effective profiles that I showed a couple slides ago versus this one. These are much smaller. They focus on particular areas, okay? Perhaps the comfort zone. You're the drowning workaholics here because you tend to push performance. You're the obsessive monitor or the micromanager that I mentioned earlier. Right here, you're the chaotic adaptive because it's all about change. I still remember working with a consultant that mentioned as Bob, who used to come up with, idea after idea to the point that we refer to him as a scatter diagram. There are all kinds of dots all over, and there's no closure. There's no attention to execution because he did not have the execution skills. It was all about ideas and change and something new. So when this happens in organization, just imagine what happens if your boss keeps changing everything and things start to become less consistent. There's not enough balance there. This is the chaotic adaptive. So once again, the idea here is to be aware of your own access and to drive balance as much as you can by developing a capacity all across the model. This is the metaphor that you see here. Be aware of your blind spots. Understand the competencies that are needed now and in the future. Identify your strengths and weaknesses. Profile awareness is something that I keep pushing in my management development programs. You need to be aware of that. Sometimes you need validation that comes from outside. We go 180 to peers that provide their inputs and insights about how well you perform your managerial role. Sometimes we go beyond that into 360. We get some inputs from your supervisors or from your employees. I know that there are some organizations that go all the way as far as 540 by getting stakeholders' views about how well managers perform their roles. But once again, the idea here is to try to have a very solid understanding of your strengths and then be aware of your vulnerabilities. Okay, this is something that is very important because, as you will see later, it is an imperative to fix yourself first before fixing your employees. Something that sometimes managers, especially those that operate under the theory X presumptions, tend to neglect. So comparing the perceptions of others, versus how you perceive yourself is always important. I know that in the field of communication, we have a model that is called direct confrontation, where you are situated right in the middle, and then others provide their inputs about what's so good about you, what you need to continue, what you need to stop, what you need to learn, what you need to unlearn. These are all the same ideas here to try to have a very good understanding of how others view you and what are the steps that you need to take to change. So often the problem, if you look at the bottom of this slide, which is very important, is a misfit of personality trait, or simply because of stress or crisis. This is a model that we developed that suggests the 4 predominant personality traits. I'm going to skip some of the evidence that suggests how we correlated the traits with the roles, because I think that more importantly, this is the article that we publish with the results of our research in this area. This is a multi-dimensional scaling model that allows us to see some hidden connections between the different parts of the model. You can see clearly that traits are fully aligned with the roles within the competing values framework. We use intervening variables called mindsets that help us to create the right connection between attributes or personality traits and leadership roles. I'm going to skip these definitions here, and I'll go quickly to the traits and roles. What we did in that empirical research, we correlated traits with roles. And the whole idea here was very simple. Indeed, we need to match the roles that we use with the direction of the organization, but we also need to match the personality traits with the roles and behaviors that we use in matching the new direction of the organization. So once again, here we were able to correlate the different roles and the different traits. And then we use that to develop an understanding of what happened when there are certain traits that tend to overwhelm other traits to the point that create an imbalance. And that's what you see here. This is one example. Actually, it comes from a real example of a real person. I'll refer to him as Ken, that was very amicable, with a bias toward participation and consultative processes. He loved engagement, and at the same time, he was conscientious in a sense that he was using analytics and formal logic to try to set up the conditions for interactions. A nice guy, you might say, but the problem is that the right side on the personality trait model was missing. So while he was agreeable, and conscientiousness obviously was part of his, forte, yet he did not feel well with change, and he was not as decisive as was expected. Later, we did some research that evolved into the impact of stress and crisis on managers. You can see a reference to the downsizing and the hyper-effective manager. It's a multi-level study that we did that evolved around the mergers and acquisitions of the late 90s and early 2000s. We found out that the surviving managers became hyper-effective in a way that they start to push to access the different roles, not willing to give up or switch gear and try to use those roles in a way that balance the different behaviors. And it was pretty difficult, but once again, too much stress tend to push you to your comfort zone. You start to develop the need to act based on what you feel comfortable with. And it goes back to the whole notion of under crisis or under stress situation, all of us tend to fall back on our natural response systems. So if I'm very good in analytics, then I'm going to push the numbers and the evidence. If I'm very good with my intuition, so then I'll try to push some ideas, or I'll try to be a little bit more philosophical, and so on and so forth. Once again, the whole idea of matching and rematching, aligning and realigning, calibrating and recalibrating is very important here. Here's the example of how stress tends to affect performance, and I'm sure that you're familiar with, this role model right here. When stress is relatively low, it helps to, it's the inverted U. I cannot see the title because it's covered by part of the Zoom bars there. But the whole idea here is that as stress starts to go up, then your performance starts to be affected. So it's not only behaviorally, it's also in terms of your, here it is, inverted U relationship. Going back to the notion of personality traits and trait extremes, when you push your predominant trait to excess, then remember, these tend to activate the role that correlate with it. And before you know it, you start to play to your weakness rather than playing to your strength. So a couple of examples here. You're rigid because you're not agreeable enough. You're careless. You're not conscientious enough. You're pretty weak. Or you are headstrong. You're not open to new ideas. And I'm sure you're familiar with Woody Allen here. I don't know if I'm using the right examples here, but that's what came to my mind. So then, of course, this is something that you need to be aware of. And otherwise, this is one of the major causes of leadership failure: the inability to adapt, the inability to recalibrate, the inability to learn new skills and get out of your comfort zone. So why leader fails? Trouble interpersonal relationships because you tune out, you're not in agreement with others. Inability to meet objectives. If you can re-visualize the competing values framework, and I know that that's a major challenge because you don't have it in front of you, this is part of the lower right quadrant. I'm sorry, lower left quadrant, where formal logic is very important. You're not able to initiate structure, you're not able to coordinate, you're not able to integrate, and this is part of the failure. Do not know how to lead a team, you're not assertive enough. Sometimes, especially during crisis, there's a tendency to defer judgment to the leader. And if you're not there for your team, if you're not assertive, if you cannot lead, then there's an issue here. It reminds me one of the episodes from Seinfeld. I know Josh and I talked a little bit about this before, but this is a different episode, Josh. It's the episode where George Costanza is taking care of kids in a room, and all of a sudden there's fire that caused by something that they could not control. And he was the first to run out of the door. And when they stopped him and they asked him what's going on here, he responded with his usual ritual and the way, the facial expression, hey, I'm the leader, I want everybody to follow me. That's not the idea here. Obviously, the idea here goes beyond that. You need to become a role model. You need to use your own mental model, your self-concept, how you think about yourself and about the group that you lead, and help them to become a better team. And finally, lack of behavioral flexibility. You're not open to new ideas. You're not open to change. That pretty much lacked the upper right quadrant on the competing values framework. And when this happens, you resort more to forces of stability, and you start to close your organization and your ability to change. You lag behind the market. So I'm very quickly, I want to take some of these notions. I'm not sure how we do in terms of time, into some of the research that I'm engaged now involving COVID-19. I know I did a lot of work in this area that evolved into hospital administration, hospital ratings, the patient experience, and so on and so forth. But at some point, I shifted gear and I started to investigate notions of trusted leadership and empathy, the two that are stand out in terms of leadership qualities in fighting the COVID pandemic. There's some interesting adaptive challenges there too, because it's a crisis. It's catastrophic in essence. That is an organization, you're not built to manage the non-routine. That put a lot of pressure on you as an organizational leader to readapt and to make sure that you have the right qualities to lead a time of crisis. Some examples come actually from Taiwan and New Zealand. In any rate, you will see that empathy and trust that are all part of emotional intelligence help, in this case, Taiwan's leader, to pretty much control the coronavirus. And you can see the results here. And if you can see the chart, you will see that the starting point is actually January 21st, 2020. And when I looked at it again, it was exactly 1 year later, January 21st, 21. And just compare the situations here in the US versus the situation there. There's a lot of work in this area that once again elevated the whole notion of trusted leadership and empathy. And I'm doing it as we speak now in some new empirical research on this area. So EI skills, obviously emotional intelligence skills, are game changer when it comes to managing crises such as COVID-19. Here's the example from New Zealand, and you can see once again empathy was highlighted as the defining leadership style of Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And I have to read this as stated. She communicates in a clear, consistent, and soothing manner. There's a high level of trust and confidence in her leadership skills and ability to manage COVID-19 pandemic. One of the questions that we ask ourselves is how much empathy should be used, and whether the whole notion of balance that I mentioned earlier should apply also to empathy. So this comes from researchers, and it was published by the Academy of Management, that suggests that on the one hand, and let me see if I can summarize it in a focused way. You can use empathy because this helps you to understand emotions of others, but too much empathy perhaps is not good because you can become permissive, maybe even submissive, to the point that you will not be able to make quick decision or smart decisions about new directions, simply because, and you can see in red what it says there, your over-reliance on emotions. So I guess one of the idea here, and we're doing some work, is to try to understand how much of empathy you need to use. This is one example from the bailout of the AIG. This is a standout in the literature about how Robert Ben Moshe was the CEO of AIG during the bailout. And I remember seeing and hearing about the pretty close to $500 million that he provided in bonuses. Well, the reason for that was his extreme emotions that he used to make the decision about why employees need this money. Okay, so that was one example of access that turned empathy into something that got him to make a decision that was viewed by others as not the right decision at that time. So again, a key here is balance. I want to go back to it and very quickly suggest to you some work by McKinsey Consulting Group. And I've highlighted the word empathy there in yellow. Show empathy and be supportive, understand and sense how other people feel. You need to show your authenticity. You need to build trust. You need to inspire others. These are some elements that are important in fighting COVID because it helps to bond people together, especially in social system. The second point is to operate with strong results orientation, develop and communicate a vision of success, set objectives, but at the same time, remember that you also need to follow through to achieve results. You need to emphasize efficiency, productivity, but you also need to prioritize high-value work. The third point, seek different perspective. Make sure to encourage employees to contribute ideas to improve performance. Differentiate between important and unimportant issues. Give the appropriate weight to stakeholder concerns. Do not neglect them. And finally, solve problems effectively. And you can do that by gathering, analyzing, and considering inputs that come from executives. What I did in my work, I took McKinsey's ideas and I map out these ideas using the competing values framework. And you can see clearly that the 4 principles of behavior during crisis or in response to COVID are distributed well across the competing values framework and how they relate to the different roles that executives play. Taskmaster is concerned with efficiency and productivity, the motivator with empathy, vision setter perspective, because it's about new ideas, new vision, and analyzer with problem solving. So going back to a point that that I mentioned earlier, when you are aware of your own profile in terms of your vulnerabilities or weaknesses, shortcomings, and your strengths, make sure that you reveal your weaknesses, not in a way that show overconfidence, but in a way that can help you establish trust and build perhaps solidarity between you and your followers, you and your employees. Become a sensor, rely on your instincts and intuition to detect information, perhaps new trends. Pick up some nonverbal cues that comes from my corporate communication hat. And help yourself to better understand how others view you. Try to validate your own perceptions with the perceptions of others. This is an adaptive challenge that is important because it's going to move you away from pushing your strength to excess into the whole balance, into the whole idea of developing a capacity around the competing values framework that will allow you to become adaptive. Practice staff empathy, is very important here because the idea here is to balance respect for individuals and at the same time to remember the task at hand by giving people what they need, not what they want. There's a big difference between the two. And finally, do not over differentiate, because here the idea here is to capitalize on what is unique about you by being somewhat aloof, because leaders who promote their differences, but who do not conceal their weaknesses are usually ineffective, right? So we want to make sure that you do not over differentiate, but at the same time, you're aware of your surrounding. So once you fix yourself first, then fix your employees. This is very important because it comes from a lot of executive coaching that I did where there was, or there is a tendency to look at yourself by saying, I'm good. Are you good? No, you're not. So then you need to be fixed. You need to go through training. You need to reskill, to retool. I don't need to do anything to myself because I'm good in all fronts. Well, the call here, once again, is to be aware of your own weaknesses, fix yourself first, and then fix, the others. So this is more like what surveys says versus how managers, adapt and readapt. I think there's one more bullet here. And you can see from the diagram, and I'm looking at the 1% here, you can see clearly that these are managers who can successfully use all 4 leadership styles. And if we can use that metaphor and reapply to the competing values framework, only 1% are able effectively to navigate or maneuver or move around the different quadrants in a way that can help optimize their behavioral flexibility. The other cluster involved the 20%. These are managers who successfully use several styles. So sometimes they can direct, at other times they can facilitate, and yet in other times they probably will be able to sell ideas or use consultative approach. The main idea here is to try to expand your repertoire of behaviors, and that's the call here. Become aware of your outlier tendencies, become aware of your personality traits, your leadership roles and behavior. And if you have a good understanding of where you are, you'll be able to adapt or learn to adapt. And if you can't, one option for you is to delegate, to empower. Another option, and I'm currently engaged in a lot of research in that leadership, is to use co-leadership to try to collaborate with others. This way, the skills that the two sides bring to the picture are complementary. I know that this model exists in healthcare, and it's actually the major theme of my latest book on that leadership. But the idea here is to try to use co-leadership in a way that can help you overcome your weaknesses by relying heavily on your partner. Josh, do we have time to take a look at this video?
How long is the video?
2.5 minutes.
Oh yeah, let's go ahead and do that. You have to change your screen share to the YouTube channel.
What?
It looks like it's a
Shall I click stop share?
So yeah, so pause your video and then you're going to click stop share and then you got to share where the video is. So it sounds like it's probably YouTube.
Okay, I'm sorry. So where are we now? Can you see the slide or can you see the video?
You're not sharing yet, so you're going to click share screen and then just pick the web browser where your YouTube video is being played.
This one, right?
Okay, so it looks like you're sharing the presentation still.
I'll click here, you will see the video or you will see the presentation again.
It's still the presentation. So when you click that, it opens up the YouTube video. What you'll need to do is share the YouTube video screen.
So I need to click. Okay, so I need to click on this first.
Click on that to open the video. Yep, and then pause the video because it's going to open up on a different screen.
I paused it, and now it says your screen sharing. So, do you see it now?
No,
I'm sorry.
It's still the presentation. No, that's okay.
Is there a way for you to share it? It's the very last slide.
Yeah, if you want to stop share, I can pull it up.
Okay, please
Not a
do.
problem.
Okay,
In the meantime,
so,
while I'm doing that, if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask Dr. Belasen, I'd be happy to facilitate that for you. I'll be happy to ask that of him while we pull this up. Feel free to type that in the chat box. Alan, is that the name of the video itself?
yes, it's a metaphor. Who is the right? I mean,
Well,
we can just skip it.
Yeah, that's fine. We can always put it in the
Exactly.
send out the presentation.
Let's go to the Q&A.
Okay, so I'll keep looking for this, but here's a couple of points made. Is number one is standard transmissions are sorely underappreciated, and I'm not sure I'll ever go back to an automatic again. We choose talking about, I think, cars. But here's the question: is do you see a correlation? Do you see a correlation between generations? She says, I am 100% Gen X, but would probably more identify with Gen Y. So do you see a correlation between generations and leadership traits? And it says, I feel like the newer or younger generations tend to be more empathetic and are more focused on employee well-being, et cetera. So you could speak to the generational aspect of leadership.
No, this is a very interesting observation. I haven't done any research in this area, and I think that this is a wonderful area of research because in the far analysis, it is the younger generation that is going to lead this country. At minimum, all these organizations that we're talking about. So yes, this is a very important question. My hope is that we are able to understand that even empathy do not need to be pushed to the limit. Yes, I agree, and I read here from the chat, generation tend to be more empathetic and are more focused on employee well-being. That is correct. But at the same time, let's remember that there's a very delicate trade-off here. The other side of the picture is the performance and the need for structure and so on and so forth. So I guess the short answer to that, it's a very interesting area of research that is under investigated.
Great. So I actually have a question slash comment, because I think we talked before we got on about a lot of the different things related to this, and I was really happy to see so much about emotional intelligence in here, and empathy being one of the biggest aspects, right, of the social awareness aspect. So I refer a lot to Daniel Goleman when it comes to emotional intelligence, and there's those 4 quadrants: self-management, self-awareness, social awareness, and relationships. And what are your thoughts on, can somebody, you mentioned earlier how somebody can be over empathetic, and almost cripples them. So do you feel that someone can be over empathetic and not self-aware, or does empathy and self-awareness of emotions kind of go hand in hand? Because it seems like some people spend so much time focusing on other people's feelings and thoughts that they don't ever spend any time for self-care. So I'm just wondering what your perspective on.
Josh, you just answered your very same question. Yes, this happen all the time, and also I can see the reverse of it, right? You tend to focus more on yourself and less on the others. In communication, I don't know if this can help, but in the field of corporate communication, there is a wonderful model, a very practical, called the Johari window. Are you familiar with it by any chance? The Johari window suggests the open window on one hand, if I remember the different parts of it. Then there's the blind, there's the hidden, and then there's the closed. And the whole idea is to try to expand the open window in a way that will allow you to better understand yourself, understand how you are viewed by others, and the need for change. But then, of course, there are also the dynamics that come from the blind and the hidden. This is where you provide feedback, but you get nothing, or you do not provide feedback, and at the same time, you expect others to provide you with a lot of information that then create a lot of tension. And of course, the fourth window is the closed one, or maybe even the closed-minded one, the one that doesn't like to give feedback, and at the same time doesn't like to get feedback from others. You become part of a splendid isolation. I think that all of these dynamics are pretty realistic. And of course, add to that crisis situation, such as the pandemic, to have a better understanding of how overwhelming this need to adapt and readapt is forcing us to think hard and even change the way that we think and the way that we behave.
Yes, thank you. A couple more questions I want to jump right in here is, what advice will you give to a 20-something-year-old manager having team members of all age groups in terms of building good work relationship with a personal touch?
Wow. When I teach my MBA classes, I always tell them, you go out there and you come with your, new set of skills and knowledge and excitement and energy. And you're very enthusiastic, very hopeful about the future. And all of a sudden, you meet a senior manager that tells you, hey, listen to me carefully. I'm here for over 20 years. You're not here to tell me what to do. So keep everything that you learn outside of the scope of our relationship. Just do what I'm asking you to do. This creates an immediate tension, if not frustration. And I've seen this in action all the time. I think that if we go back to some of the notions that we discussed during this presentation, have a good understanding of who you are and what you bring with you to the basket of the behaviors and skills that everybody perhaps have or share, but have also a good understanding of where they come from. It's not that I'm asking younger people to put their feet in the shoes of others and start to, behave differently. But what I think is reasonable to expect is to have a better understanding that there's a lot of experience out there, a lot of wisdom out there that can be used, that can help, and therefore synergy should become the model of your relationship. I don't know if I answered the question here, but feel free to share your insights.
Perfect. No, that was good. Thank you. We have another question. I work in healthcare and have seen that the dyad model has been very successful at my healthcare institution. What are some of the leadership qualities that you see healthcare providers lack as compared to traditional upper management regarding leadership?
Well, first of all, there's the tension between, the traditional administrative roles and the clinicians, nurses, physicians, the professionals all together, those that, have, the perspective of evidence-based. For them, expertise, competence is more important than decision-making processes that are based on intuition or administrative view of what needs to be done. There's obviously the tension that exists between administrators and, clinicians. The clinicians view administrators as obviously less sensitive to the patient care needs. And administrators, on the other hand, look at physicians in these examples, and they always view them as people that think more about, the field that they cover and less about the broader goals of the organization. For me, when I suggested the whole idea of using dyad and triad leadership or co-leadership altogether in healthcare systems, the idea was to try to leverage the complementary skills that both sides bring to the picture. And so if they're able to do that, the differences become as important as the similarities. Then the whole notion of bringing those skills to decision-making situations become much more, important for organizational performance.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so that is the only questions I see in the chat for now. If anyone has any other questions or they wanted to unmute themselves and share any kind of perspectives or reflections after Dr. Belasen's talk this evening, we certainly are welcome that. While we're over the scheduled time, the fact that there's still 23 of us here, I think says that this is something we're all very passionate about. So we can certainly take a few additional minutes. If anyone wants to share anything through text or if they wanted to unmute themselves, please feel free. But in the meantime, I'll just formally say thank you so much. Oh, I didn't realize my camera was off. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and your attention this evening, and Dr. Belasen for sharing all of this wonderful concepts for us to really digest and think about in our own leadership roles, or for those that are looking to go into leadership roles, how we can adapt some of these things moving forward into that. So I'll keep this open and live for 10 more minutes or whatever. Feel free to unmute yourself or talk or ask another question, and we'll just hang out and wait for that. But thank you everyone for coming to this Ray in Action series where we get to feature our experts, our faculty experts, and certainly at the top of that list is Dr. Alan Belasen. So thank you again for this evening. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did as well.
Absolutely, and I see some notes there from Megan and from Irene, and I hope that it wasn't deja vu for them. My hope was that I went beyond of what I'm teaching to introducing some new concepts. So, yeah, appreciate all these comments. And I see Hannah there too. So, oh, that's neat. Yeah, that's great. This is neat. I guess the next presentation should go deep into the how How do we close the gap? How do we do all of these things that we talked about?
Yeah, what are some tactical strategies and how do we actually?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is neat. I didn't even realize the time. It's already 8:19.
Yeah.
So yeah, here Irene says, yeah, that would be great. Okay, inviting his vice presidents from 7 different regions across the US to come to New York City to a 2-day meeting with us, the consultants. What they didn't know is that he shared with us that this is my vision for my organization, and we map out his vision across the quadrants, and we know exactly where he is positioning himself. And the problem was that they were stuck in their previous profiles. So a lot of what he wanted to do were on the outside of the model, on the right side of the model, and a lot of what they had to offer was located in the left side of the model, with some sort of resistance to move from the left to the right. So the whole consulting engagement was to try to help them to realign their leadership profiles with the new vision of the CEO. And that was a major challenge.
Oh, yeah.
It took us almost 3 months. It was sort of unfortunate for one of them, but I cannot share the results. I have so many examples. I have another example with middle managers. The whole idea was to try to improve the communication that they have with first-line supervisors. First-line supervisors at the aggregate level keep complaining that there is not enough communication with middle managers. So we came to the meeting with 80 middle managers sitting in the audience.
Oh boy.
What they didn't know, listen to this, what they didn't know is their first-line supervisor are starting to send us inputs about their rating, how they rate the middle managers on a scale from 0 to 10, how effective they are in terms of their communication with their first-line supervisor, who happen to be their direct reports. The CEO turned to the 80 managers and said, how would you rate your effectiveness as a communicator?
Okay.
What do you think was the aggregate? What do you think was the answer?
What was the scale?
It was very high. It was 8.5.
Oh, geez.
Okay. In the meantime, we got inputs from the direct reports. All 400 of them sent us inputs at the aggregate. What do you think was the average?
4.
In terms of the effectiveness of the communication of the middle manager with you, the first line supervisor? What do you think was the average?
Half of that.
It was even less than that, 3.5.
Wow.
So the difference was 5. And I do this because I will never, ever forget that. I'm sitting to his right, my partner is sitting to his left. He's looking at his middle managers and he's saying, look, it's evidence-based. Here's what you say, here's what they say. You need to realign, you need to readapt. I'm giving you 90 days to move from 3.5, and he did this, to the 8.5 that you suggested. And that was the whole coaching there.
Wow.
Took us forever.
Some fun stories about, really the impact of what people think, what they think they feel versus what they think they know. And I mean, I've seen studies like that, but not in that context, but like what they think that the experience should be versus what it actually is, like the 2 different perspectives. And it's amazing the different gaps in those needs analysis, trying to figure out what are the gaps and how do you, what's the root cause of those. And then you bring out the fishbone diagram and you're doing all this stuff to try to
exactly
get them to answer those 5 whys and all those questions. But well, listen, maybe we should
wait. There's a question here. There's a question. How did the middle managers react to the results? Irene is asking. Were they panicked?
Oh yeah, I bet they did.
It was a phobic reaction. They couldn't believe it, but it was very objective. They had some choices there, and as it turned out, they super inflated their own view of themselves. They were not as effective as they thought. It goes back to the point that I made during the presentation, the difference or the gap between how you view yourself and how others view you. And that's what you need to manage. And that's part of emotional intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. Relationship management.
What I think about a lot of times when you see managers, or or not managers, but organizations will inform managers that they're going to do a 360-degree feedback assessment. And I know there's a lot of different tools out there where you have to have everyone that's on your team evaluate you, and imagine you thinking, oh, you're doing a wonderful job, and then reading these results. It's not no, and obviously it's anonymous, but a little bit of a different situation. But I've actually seen that, I've experienced that, where you think you're doing X, and then you read this like, why do they think I'd say that? How do they feel that way? In an anonymous environment, people are completely different animals. you know.
Yeah, exactly.
But at any rate, it is 8:30, so I think, at least for me, I need to wrap up. I'd love to talk about this all night long, but I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And I don't necessarily need to end this. You all could continue to talk if you'd like. But in the meantime, we will, this video is recorded, so I will make it available, and we'll send it out to everyone who RSVP'd, because there were, several who weren't able to join us, but they should still watch this video.
And Josh, I did not know that Augustine was here, and he gave you a nice compliment there. So
Oh, he
it's
gave you a nice
nice.
compliment too.
Oh, he did? I
No,
didn't even see it.
No, I mean, no, it's not. We're here to learn and share our thoughts and have this wonderful conversations. And I'm just grateful that you
I loved it. This
were
is
able to
great.
be a part of this. And hopefully maybe we can do this again on other topics as well, and go from there. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We're down to 9, so I think we'll just end it for the night. But thank you so much, and we'll just keep in touch on this, and enjoy.
Thanks again. Take care, everybody.
All right, good night.
Okay, good night.